Well, hi, everybody. Let's get started. Thank you for joining us for this New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center Climate Academy. My name is Jean Herb, and along with my colleague Marjorie Kaplan, who you could see in the Hollywood Square boxes, we co-direct the Climate Change Resource Center, which is a climate service center that was set up here in New Jersey by an act of the legislature in 2020. The Resource Center is available to provide assistance to all sorts of end users, government, local government, NGOs, communities, policymakers, business community to advance sustainable and equitable climate solutions. So we're really glad that you're here today and joining us with some of our colleagues from New Jersey, but also from the Georgetown Climate Center. The purpose of this webinar is to be able to present some analysis that's been done by our friends and colleagues at the Georgetown Climate Center, which is housed at the Georgetown Law School. And I'm sure our colleague James Bradbury will give you a quick summary of what the Georgetown Climate Center does. With regard to different scenarios of investments for federal transportation infrastructure dollars and the impact and the opportunities that those investments may present to contributing towards New Jersey's attainment of its climate goals, particularly goals with regard to emissions reductions in the 2030-2050 timeframe. So we have four speakers here today. We have James Bradbury, who's the mitigation manager at the Georgetown Climate Center. And the way that we'll operate this webinar is that James will give a presentation based on the analysis that's been led by our friends at Georgetown. And then after James presents, which he'll talk for about 20 minutes or so, then the next step is that we will open it up to three New Jersey colleagues here who will give a response, and we'll have a conversation with them. And that includes our colleague, John Carnegie, who is the executive director of the Georgetown Climate Center. No, not the Georgetown Climate Center, the Voorhees Transportation Center, which is housed at the Blaustein School at Rutgers University. We will also be joined by our colleague, Zoe Baldwin, who's the New Jersey director for the Regional Plan Association. And then we will also be joined by Alex Ambrose from the New Jersey policy perspective. So the way that we'll host this is that we'll have kind of a conversation with our three respondents, as well as with James among them. And then what we'll do is we'll leave a good solid 15 minutes or so at the end for us to take questions from all of you regarding the presentation, regarding the conversation. And to be able to do that, my colleague Marjorie Kaplan will monitor the chat and we'll be able to take questions from the chat. So you are welcome to put your questions in the chat at any point during the presentation, and then we will, Marjorie will be able to relay them to the panelists. So please feel free to use the chat. Our colleague Matt Drews is here today, and he is our technology guru. And so if we run into any glitches, Matt will help us. So every now and then you might help us, you might hear us say, Matt, what should we do about this or that? Marjorie will also put into the chat the website, the link for the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, where we will post a recording of this webinar. And then she will also put in a link to the location on the Georgetown Climate Center's website, where you'll be able to see some of the base work, the analytical work that Georgetown has done to support the presentation that James will be giving today. So I think that's everything in terms of background and logistics. So with that, I am going to invite our Marjorie, as well as our three respondents. They can go off camera and mute, and we will turn it over to James, who will give his presentation and share his slides. James, at any point, if you need help with slides, just give us all a shout.
Great, thank you. So let me try to get my slides up right now. Let me know if you can see that.
I see them.
Great, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jean. Should I just go ahead and get started?
Yeah, would you please get started? But again, at any point, if you need anything, just yell to me or Marjorie or Matt.
Will do. Great.
Thank
You so much, Jean and Marjorie, and really looking forward to the discussion after my presentation. So good afternoon, everyone. Really happy to be with you today to share results from our analysis of the bipartisan infrastructure law and how implementation in New Jersey could affect transportation emissions. For those who don't know us, the Georgetown Climate Center is a law and policy institute at the Georgetown University Law Center. We work at the nexus of federal, state, and local policy to help support climate leadership on emissions mitigation and adaptation. I lead the mitigation side of our work and currently focus a lot of my attention on how states like New Jersey can leverage federal dollars to achieve their climate goals. So today I'll share our analysis of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which presents a major opportunity for New Jersey to build on recent successes and go further to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation in particular. For starters, I'll walk you through different investment scenarios that New Jersey could pursue using the nearly $17 billion of surface transportation funding that we estimate could come to the state from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And for those who are familiar, this builds on a similar US-wide analysis that we published at the end of 2021, shortly after the bipartisan infrastructure law was signed into law. And that, I believe, is in the chat. A link to that report is in the chat. I think Marjorie put that in. Okay, and for this state-specific analysis, we found that a range of emission outcomes are possible, depending on the investment scenario or portfolio that New Jersey chooses to pursue during program implementation. And finally, I'll conclude with a couple thoughts on the policy implications, and then I'm eager to hear insights from my fellow panelists. So as I'm sure you know, transportation is the single biggest contributor to emissions, to carbon emissions in the US and in New Jersey. In New Jersey, transportation accounts for about 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And according to estimates in the most recent Global Warming Response Act report published by New Jersey DEP in the fall of 2020, New Jersey will need to reduce transportation emissions by 87% for the state to meet its mandate to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 80% below 2006 levels by 2050. And to achieve these targets, the same report estimates that 88% of new light-duty vehicles will need to be zero emissions by 2030, rising to 100% of sales by 2035, and 75% of medium duty, 50% of heavy duty trucks on the road will need to be zero emission by 2050. New Jersey has made good progress on vehicle electrification in a couple important ways. New Jersey is a so-called ZEV state, committed to advancing regulations that will enable the state to achieve ambitious electric vehicle deployment goals for light duty, medium duty, and heavy duty vehicles. Additionally, New Jersey DEP has committed well over $100 million of investments in bus and truck electrification just over the last couple of years, and with a particular goal of benefiting overburdened EJ communities, environmental justice communities. These investments are also really effective greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies that come with substantial public health benefits and fuel savings for the fleet owners. Importantly, the Global Warming Response Act report also outlines additional steps needed to reduce transportation emissions in New Jersey beyond just electrification. That includes increasing transit ridership, expanding transit-oriented development, and other steps to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips. So federal funding opportunities like the bipartisan infrastructure law can help New Jersey make the additional investments necessary, both to advance electrification, but also to make the other investments that will help New Jersey achieve the transportation and climate goals. So this slide is to introduce the first two investment scenarios that we used for our modeling of transportation investments from the bipartisan infrastructure law. I want to emphasize these are illustrative scenarios. Each represent different approaches to implementation. And we took this approach because there's really no way to know exactly which projects federal, state, and local governments will decide to fund through bipartisan infrastructure law programs. And those who are not familiar with the BIL, I'll also take some time as I'm walking through this slide to briefly introduce some of those programs, both to explain our analytical approach, but also because I think this will be relevant to the panel discussion that follows my presentation. First, I want to highlight that the two biggest programs in the BIL are formula-funded highway programs, which together account for about 40% of transportation funding in the federal law. While there are some important differences between the two highway programs, the National Highway Performance Program and the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, the bottom line is that states and MPOs have a lot of flexibility regarding how they choose to spend these federal dollars. So historically, states have used these programs to pay primarily for highway projects. This includes expansion projects, which increase emissions, but also for repair and maintenance projects like resurfacing, which helps to reduce emissions. So let's begin at the top of the pie charts and move clockwise. Comparing the two scenarios, you can see that with respect to highway expansion, this represents nearly a quarter of total funding in the high emission scenario, compared to about 5% in the low scenario. For highway resurfacing, you can see the low emission scenario dedicates about a quarter of the funding to this strategy, while the high emission scenario spends relatively less on this strategy. The BIL also includes a lot of dedicated funding for what I think are great things, like EV charging infrastructure, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or NEVI, for example. That's represented by the orange wedge. There's also medium heavy-duty EV programs like the Low and No Emission Grant Program at the Federal Highways Administration for buses and bus facilities. EPA has a clean school bus program, billions of dollars going into those medium-duty, heavy-duty investments. There are several programs for funding for bike, pedestrian, and other strategies that help to reduce VMT, or vehicle miles traveled. So that includes, there's a big plus up for Transportation Alternative Set-Aside program. There's the Safe Streets and Roads for All, Reconnecting Communities pilot program. Again, billions of dollars for these types of investments, and also for improving the efficiency of highways and freight. The bipartisan infrastructure law includes, for example, the National Highway Freight Program. And so as you can see, the low emission scenario puts more money into all of these low carbon strategies. And this is possible because the big formula funded programs include a lot of flexibility that states could take advantage of, and in many cases do take advantage of, to direct highway dollars toward projects that may still involve highways, but they're designed to make the national highway system more accommodating to electric vehicles, for example, and more accessible and safe for a variety of transportation system users. Also, I should note, the funding for these investments come through a combination of formula funding and competitive grant programs. So New Jersey's total share of BIL dollars is going to ultimately depend in part on the state's ability to successfully bid for federal funding. Next, I should note that BIL has really has historic levels of funding for passenger rail and transit, in addition to the base level of transit funding that's typically provided in federal highway bills. And that's why both scenarios include roughly a third of the dollars for transit. Finally, there is a large kind of other category, because BIL also has several programs that will likely have little or no impact on emissions. For example, there's nearly $40 billion dedicated for bridges and another $5 billion for airport terminals, just to name a couple. So those investments were not accounted for in our emissions analysis. So all told, BIL includes nearly $600 billion for transportation projects over the next 5 years. And we estimate New Jersey's share of this will be almost $17 billion. So the next step in our analysis was to take New Jersey's share of the total funding and plug it into our transportation investment strategies tool to estimate how those investments could affect emissions outcomes under these two investment scenarios. And the short version of how our model works is this. For each investment strategy, we apply an impact factor to estimate how future emissions will change per dollar invested. The tool includes a total of 30 different strategy types, including 10 different strategies just for transit, just for example. And those are bundled together for the purpose of this presentation, just for display purposes. That's the last I'll say on the model, but there's detailed documentation on our website, including through the link actually already provided. If you scroll down, there's documentation on the model. Again, I want to reiterate that these two pie charts represent hypothetical investment scenarios that we developed to illustrate really the scale of potential emission impacts of bipartisan infrastructure law implementation. We did not attempt to model New Jersey's policies or the capital plans of New Jersey DOT or the New Jersey Turnpike Authority. In the end, some states will spend more of their federal funding on highway expansion projects, for example, while others less so. And my fellow panelists here will have, I think, a lot more New Jersey specific insight on this particular question. So let's jump into results. What we found is that the BIL has the potential to bend the curve down on transportation emissions, but it could also result in emissions that are higher than business as usual. And BAU, that's the dashed line on the chart. For the high emission scenario, the red line, you can see that in the first few years, it begins with emission reductions, but by 2032, emissions, or I should say 2026, emissions are trending upward. And then by 2032, they reach nearly a 2% increase in emissions relative to the baseline. And this is caused by investments in the highway expansion and the effect of induced demand. And this is an important point. When lane miles are added to highways and arterial roadways, this has a near-term effect of reducing congestion. That's why typically these projects are funded. But within a few years, the result is an increase in vehicle miles traveled. This research has really borne this out. This is a very real effect. In contrast, the low emission scenario is a shorter story to tell, but we'll get into a bit more detail on the next slide. And that's the blue line on the chart. This would result in emissions of about 1% below baseline by 2032. All right, so let's take a closer look here. So let's look at how the various investment strategies factor into our overall results. And that's what these stacked bar charts show. These are cumulative changes in emissions relative to our baseline through 2040. And I'm starting with a high emission scenario in the light blue bar, which shows the emissions impact of highway expansion investments in isolation. As I mentioned, this puts upward pressure on future emissions. And the multicolored bars on the left show the emissions benefits of the variety of low carbon strategies that I walked through just a minute ago. And for this scenario, in net, what we found is that investing just about a quarter of the total surface transportation dollars in highway expansion projects could completely reverse the emission reduction benefits of all of the other low carbon transportation investments funded by the BIL. But in contrast, on the right, looking at the low emission scenario, this shows that if highway expansion projects are minimized, then the BIL represents a real emission reduction opportunity. As I noted, without question, the law includes a lot of funding for a broad range of strategies that can help reduce emissions. And this scenario, takes advantage of that fact. The bottom line takeaway, at least, for this slide, is the percentage of funding invested in highway expansion versus other projects or other strategies is the major driver for the transportation emission outcomes of bipartisan infrastructure law implementation, at least when you're comparing these two investment scenarios. And I'll hasten to note, and we know from similar analyses that we and others have done, that there are many substantial and important economic, public health, and environmental benefits associated with this low emission scenario on the right, in addition to the climate benefits that we're focused on here. Next, I want to share results from a third very low emission scenario for this state level analysis that we've done of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And we developed this scenario working with RMI. And before diving in, I want to recognize that there is an important point that state DOTs need to balance a lot of really challenging policy goals with a limited pot of money. We get that. And I'll come back to this important point shortly. But with this new very low emission scenario, this goes beyond the low emission scenario that I just shared, perhaps obviously, and it reflects what a state could theoretically achieve from an emissions reduction standpoint if they were to make investment decisions based predominantly on GHG performance. In other words, we tried to optimize the investment portfolio for emission reductions to the maximum extent legally allowed according to federal law, which is very flexible, as I noted. And here again, I hasten to add that there may be substantial safety or other policy benefits that could be achieved through this type of investment portfolio, but our focus was just on emissions. So as you can see with this scenario, this includes zero investments, at least of these particular pots of money, in highway expansion, but still substantial levels of investments in highways. So that's for resurfacing, bridge repair, and other so-called fix-it-first highway projects. The other important introductory point about this scenario is that we assume state DOTs take full advantage of their ability to flex up to half of their highway program dollars into transportation projects, or I should say into programs that have a broader range of eligible project types. For example, from the National Highway Performance Program into the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, or even into the Federal Transit Administration programs. So that's introducing the scenario, and now we're going to look at the results. So as you can see, there are a lot of emission reductions achieved with this ramped up focus on cost-effective strategies like electric transit buses. That brown rectangle that shows heavy-duty, medium-duty electrification. Those are relatively very cost-effective strategies. Bus service efficiency, passenger rail electrification, bike and ped infrastructure, transit-oriented development. These are actually relatively cost-effective types of strategies that can be pursued if you really want to get deeper reductions from your transportation investments. And by taking this approach, the bottom line is we found that it's theoretically possible to more than double the cumulative emission reductions compared to the low emission scenario of the bipartisan infrastructure law that I showed earlier. And looking at these results over time, this shows the same graph you saw 3 slides ago, but for comparison with the green line, which of course is the very low emission scenario. And we found that a nearly 3% reduction below baseline is possible over a 10-year period without any investment in highway expansion and with this sort of maximal flexing of funds toward low carbon strategies. And this represents nearly a 5% difference between the high and very low scenarios. This may not seem like a lot in the way of possible reductions, just 5%, but I'd note just a few reasons why this does represent a big opportunity for New Jersey. First, the investments modeled should be viewed as an installment to be supplemented by other policies and future investments really of all sorts. For example, the dollars from the bipartisan infrastructure law only go through 2026. Future federal transportation funding and subsequent reauthorization bills could also be leveraged to continue driving reductions beyond those shown here. So that next 5 years of funding through 2030 or beyond could also bend these lines another few percentage points, in either direction. And second, importantly, federal dollars only represent a portion of total transportation funding. State and local transportation agencies, turnpike authorities, they can draw and do draw from other funding sources. So, and ultimately, much like bipartisan infrastructure law implementation, all of those investment decisions will, a lot of those investment decisions will matter from an emissions standpoint. So you can, with those investments, can either jumpstart or really undermine the progress that a state like New Jersey can make toward meeting its climate goals, including the ambitious targets established by the Global Warming Response Act, of course. So I'll conclude with just a few thoughts on the policy implications of this analysis. Perhaps the most important point is simply that investment decisions matter for emission outcomes. Also, federal programs provide ample flexibility for states to choose their own adventure, if you will, in ways that could help or hurt a state's efforts to achieve climate policy goals. Before making this next point, I'll just say this analysis was pretty easy. While the job of a transportation official is hard, we know that transportation planners need to meet a lot of social, economic, and environmental needs. And it's also true that many of those needs are complementary and consistent with a low carbon future, while others are less so. But how will we know if transportation planners are not accounting for GHG performance of proposed projects? How will we know where those synergies are, between safety and GHG performance if they're not accounting for GHG performance. So that's why going forward, I think it's really important for DOTs to start integrating climate change and emission considerations into their decision making. And for the most part, somewhat surprisingly, this is not yet a standard practice. And I think it will be critical to do this if states like New Jersey are going to meet their ambitious emission reduction goals and targets. And finally, perhaps it's obvious, but it's worth noting that the Biden administration has its own goals to reduce emissions in transportation, as well as other sectors. And why does this matter? Well, because the US DOT has about $100 billion in discretionary competitive grant programs that they're authorized to use in very flexible ways. So developing a robust pipeline of low carbon transportation projects with clear emission benefits and buy-in from local communities will put any state, will put New Jersey, if you do this, in a better position to bring more of those competitive grant dollars home for the benefit of the people in the Garden State. And with that, I am really eager to hear from my fellow panelists who know a lot about this.
James, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So before I call our respondents up, let me just note that I know that our chat box was being stubborn and anyone participating in the webinar was having a hard time getting questions in. So please know we've fixed that so you can add questions into the chat at this point. So let me call up Zoe and John and Alex to come on camera and off of mute, and then we'll jump into to our conversation. So just as a reminder, so we have 3 respondents to some of the really amazing analysis that we just saw from James from Georgetown Climate Center. So joining us today is John Carnegie, who's the executive director of the Allen M. Voorhees Transportation Center, which is housed at the Rutgers University Blaustein School. We also have Zoe Baldwin, who's the New Jersey director of the Regional Plan Association. And we have Alex Ambrose, who is a policy analyst at the New Jersey Policy Perspective. So thanks to all 3 of you for joining us. We really appreciate you giving us time and entering into this conversation. So let me just open it up, I think, with a couple of questions and for any and all of you, the 3 of you, and James, you're certainly welcome to jump in as well. James just gave us a really compelling presentation, which could have really tangible implications for how New Jersey decides to invest the transportation dollars coming in, both from the bipartisan infrastructure law, but also from the Transportation Trust Fund. I'm wondering if each of you could just take a few minutes and give a reaction to your sort of take-home messages from James's presentation. So let me start with John.
Sure. Thanks, Jean. And thanks, James. A great presentation. I think enlightening results. I just wanted to emphasize too, though, for everyone who is on the webinar, James pointed out, and it really needs to be emphasized, that the scenarios that he looked at do not necessarily reflect the existing capital program in New Jersey. Those numbers are all of those were sort of hypothetical, right? And when I saw the results, I wondered sort of how does that compare? How do those hypothetical scenarios compare to New Jersey's existing capital program? And as anyone in New Jersey who pays attention to transportation knows, we've had a fix it first policy that's focused on maintaining and ensuring that the transportation infrastructure stays in a state of good repair for well over a decade now. So highway expansion is not, at least in terms of state highways, not counting the expansions that happen on the Turnpike and the Parkway, which are kind of not part of this analysis and discussion because they're not federally funded. We haven't really seen a lot of expansion, right? So the scenarios don't exactly match, but the low emission scenario is a reasonable approximation of the DOT program, I think. Although the categories don't match exactly. If you did a sort of quick analysis, it looks more like the low emission scenario than high emission scenario, that's for sure. And it occurred to me that that we're at a point where we have choices to make, and a big influx of dollars to the state for transportation could be used in a variety of ways, as James pointed out. And given the emphasis of the current governor's focus on climate and the sort of existential imperative to address greenhouse gas emissions, using those dollars in climate smart ways, I think would be has the potential to be transformative. And we just really need to protect against the possibility that we backslide a bit and use that windfall to expand highways that are congested in some places. And that would be a solution that kind of goes counter to the state's climate goals.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. Zoe, do you have any take-home messages from the presentation?
Yeah, I think one kind of piece that this kind of highlighted for me was, I've said in the past, more in the lines of advocacy, but if you champion everything, you champion nothing. And I think what this data kind of helps show is if we really concentrate and focus some of this money or all of this money into major projects and major goals, we're much more likely to have it be a more transformative pot of money as opposed to kind of just an accelerator for our existing capital plan. And especially since a lot of this money, we have to be honest, is getting eaten up by inflation. And so that makes it even more of an imperative to really be purposeful and intentional in how we're spending. And I loved that one line. I'd love to reiterate it. Investment matters. It's a really important piece. And so I think that's my top line takeaway.
Thanks so much, Zoe. Alex?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having us here. I just want to say, as a point of personal privilege, I am a graduate of Rutgers and a current student at Rutgers. So it is an honor to be here on a Rutgers webinar. So my a couple of thoughts. My first thought is something that the governor has said many times, one of them at an event where Zoe got to speak, is that addressing the climate crisis is really a whole of government approach. And when we think of the climate crisis, we often think of Department of Environmental Protection has an obvious role in that. Whoever controls energy in the state, so the Board of Public Utilities in New Jersey has an obvious role in that. But I think what this shows is that there are opportunities for more of those, what people would regard as non-traditional partners, such as the Department of Transportation, even Department of Labor. They all have a role in addressing the climate crisis, and it is something that is doable, addressing the climate crisis within the bounds that they can. And the second takeaway that I have is, this report highlights something very important, which is greenhouse gas emission reductions. But these kind of investments also have a ton of co-benefits, such as reduction in pollution that specifically affects people in overburdened communities, especially in New Jersey. We have one of the highest childhood asthma rates in the country. Investments like these also make our state more accessible for people with disabilities, for people that don't have cars or can't drive cars for whatever reasons. There are a lot of co-benefits to investing in these kinds of projects aside from greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, thanks so much. John, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just think that, Alex made a really great point. The co-benefits of the strategies that are climate smart in terms of transportation are huge in terms of impact on communities, impact on the environment, on public health, et cetera. Just think about if we have, I think the very low emission scenario that James pointed out was 9% of the money spent on pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. That's like an 800% increase over what we currently how we currently program those funding. That could be massively transformative over the next decade in New Jersey, with all those co-benefits attached to it, and in terms of accessibility and active transportation and health. And we shouldn't lose sight of that, and absolutely can connect climate smart solutions to other priorities in the state, such as safety, such as making things easier and more convenient and safer for people to walk and bike. And it'd be great to use this as an opportunity to make those connections in a visible way for everybody, so that the public knows that this type of solution is really beneficial to communities and the residents of the state.
Well, so let me follow up on that, John, because what I'm hearing from all of you, and James, you're welcome to jump in here too, if you're seeing some good practices outside of New Jersey. So, just building off of the comment John just had, which is how we need to make sure that the people that are eligible for these funds are aware of the opportunity to use them to invest in climate smart strategies, but also aware of the co-benefits that come from them. So how do we make that happen? How do we make sure that not only are decision makers aware, and so they can direct these funds to climate smart investments, but that the practitioners, the end users, the applicants for the funds are aware. So let me open it up if someone wants to weigh in on that. And again, James, if you know of any states that have cracked this nut, let us know.
I'll hop in really quick and just say, from my vantage point, I have seen a lot of awareness of the programs in terms of local and state municipalities, especially since so much of the IIJA is discretionary, right? It's grant funding. But I think one of the biggest needs that we cannot lose sight of is how cumbersome federal money is to use. It is fantastically difficult, especially for small communities. And so one of the places that we also need to be directing resources, both administrative and financial resources, is towards technical assistance. And then separately, making sure that our communities have access to readily available local funding matches, because every discretionary grant requires local input, financial input. And so two of those, I think, are going to be critical. There were several small communities in New Jersey that actually turned away CARISA funding, the COVID relief aid, because of how difficult it was. The cost benefit analysis didn't play out. And that is the last thing that we want to see with this money. We need to make sure that we show Congress that we can use this money and that they should keep giving us money, because we can spend it, we can get it out on the street. And part of that's going to be helping communities in that process.
Yeah, just to build on what Zoe said, the funding pools and certainly the state transportation trust fund monies could be used to build that capacity. I think, if we thought creatively about standing up an engineering and design corps or project management corps, both that provide assistance to local governments, particular counties and municipalities to actually get projects out, to design projects that are climate smart, improve safety, benefit communities, and to get those projects on the street and completed. The technical capacity of local governments, even to use their local aid money in creative ways, is very limited. So we have an opportunity perhaps to create a new resource, because there's additional funding that can actually help and advance those projects at the local level.
I love that idea. James, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think Zoe and John are pointing to really important points. The capacity of governments, to state and particularly local governments, to get creative and take full advantage of the resources available. That is a real challenge, and it's definitely, I'm glad that's being highlighted. But I think I will make the point that most of the dollars are going to projects from the bipartisan infrastructure law and past highway reauthorization bills, go to projects that are developed through state DOT run transportation planning processes, through engagement with MPOs and so forth. But the DOTs really have a really important role to play in deciding, sort of lining up the pipeline of projects. And to sort of, I think part of the question was, how do we know which projects are good and are going to be performing well from an emissions standpoint? Well, there's the rub. We aren't actually doing a very good job in a transparent way of accounting for that, and by we, I mean state DOTs. And I'm not picking on New Jersey DOT. There are only a couple around the country that really do this explicitly. Colorado now has regulation that requires it, actually requires reductions from their capital program. California has been doing it for a few years. Others have VMT reduction targets and goals. But when it comes down to the actual investment decisions, the prioritization of projects typically doesn't account for greenhouse gas emissions at all. Might account for pollution, might account for water quality, those sort of environmental issues, but GHGs aren't even on the radar. So that's a big change, I think, that folks can hopefully state DOTs will start to make soon.
It sounds like there are a couple models we could look at. Alex?
Yeah, I think it's also another huge hurdle is the political realities of the 21st century. Fossil fuel companies are spending massive amounts of money on disinformation. They know that investing in projects like these means that their shareholders will lose profits. And the fossil fuel companies that have harmed us for so long are starting to realize that when reports like this come out, that it just goes to show how car dependent New Jersey is. Transportation is the biggest greenhouse gas emitter sector in New Jersey by a pretty decent amount. And I think it's no secret that we are a very car dependent state. So the political realities of how much has been invested into making sure that projects like these do not move forward. And a lot of that disinformation funding goes into decisions if we aren't careful and if we aren't taking into account ahead of time strategies and priorities such as greenhouse gas reduction. Oh, you're muted, Jean.
Okay, so thanks. So you'd think after 3 years we all had figured out Zoom. So let me ask this question. I feel like some of the things that we're hearing and talking about are almost too good to be true, right? So we're saying we can make transportation investments in a way that not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions and contribute to our climate goals, the state's climate goals, but they can be investments that also contribute to some of our other statewide goals: environmental justice, safe and vibrant communities, improvement in health, and particularly improvement in health equity. If the outcomes are so positive from climate smart transportation investments, why haven't we been more aggressive in the past in making sure and holding ourselves accountable to ensure that dollars, particularly federal dollars, are invested in these sorts of ways? So let me open that up. I'm sorry if it's like sort of too provocative, but it seems like it's the elephant in the room. John, you want to start us off?
One reason is because it's hard. We're used to highway departments delivering us highways, and asking of those agencies to do other things in a sizable way is hard to do, and to move the engineering profession and the labor unions and everybody else that's involved and invested in the roadway construction operations and maintenance world in a direction that maybe is less investment in new capacity and things like that, then it's just hard. I think also a lot of the public, we talk, we're always in a bubble here, right? Where we think it's great, we can see it, we see the benefits. The public, I think in general, the general public doesn't necessarily always make those connections. People like to drive. It's convenient to drive. The options available now in New Jersey and lots of places in the country are limited in so many ways that make them not a viable option. That the support for this from the public is something we have to build, right? So we have to build that constituency, I think, to make these kind of transformative changes to how we invest the dollars, and it's hard.
Yeah, and if I can just add to what John said
jump in.
about us being in a bubble, a little bit. I think of if you walked up to someone on the street and asked, "What's more exciting, a Tesla or a protected bike lane?" They're probably going to say a Tesla. These kinds of investments are so important, but they're not necessarily always the flashiest, and they're not always, the sexiest. And now we're starting to realize that these kinds of investments are essential to, keeping a livable planet, and also, like we've all said, a lot of those co-benefits. So, there is the reality of what is exciting. And there's also something else John said, the realities of the workforce. A lot of these technologies, especially, something like electric vehicle charging, we need people that can build them. We need people that can maintain them. We need people that can fix these kinds of vehicles. These programs are multi-year programs to train them. So the best time to start training someone would have been many, many years ago, and the next best time to start training someone is now.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Zoe or James, you want to add to this?
I'll just add a quick note that, in transportation land and sometimes in development, people use the probably trite at this point phrase, "If you build it, they will come." And unfortunately, that is largely true for all transportation investments, but very much so for roads, because they're all connected. There's a lot of them, and we're all very used to using them. And so part of what we need, and part of what these investments could eke out, is the culture. We need to make it easy. We need to make it convenient. If you have to take 3 buses to get somewhere, you're not going to take the bus if you have another option. And so I think so many people don't think about, but they think of bike lanes as like, oh, I'm going to go for a bike ride for fun. And we need to make it a comfortable and cultural shift towards using these towards active transportation as functional transportation as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
I was going to say, we could build dedicated bike lanes throughout the state and give everybody an e-bike with the amount of money that's available in the right. Just think about that. There's so much opportunity if we think creatively.
Yeah, it's big.
I really love the responses. Well, that's a great question. I love the responses by my fellow panelists. But I'm also going to go back to I think the first thing that John said, which is, we've come to expect from our highway agencies for them to build highways, which does make a certain amount of sense. But I think that's to the sort of solution side. And one reason why it's hard is because it requires the folks in the highway agency to talk to and work with the transit agency, and also with the utilities, as you're talking about putting in new infrastructure for charging, and talk to housing agencies, because we have a housing crisis. And if we're going to do transit-oriented development, we're talking about smart growth. We're talking about really working across agencies, getting out of silos. That is not easy to do. There are culture shifts that need to happen, but we can, I think by getting outside of our silos and working across agencies, I think we can make a lot more progress on these things. And I'll just drop in the chat the new U.S. National Blueprint for Transportation Decarbonization. It's a report from the federal government, and it is it's a blueprint from energy, transportation, environment, also HUD. So it's across all these agencies, really thinking about energy, transportation, environment, and HUD. I think those are the 4 agencies. So I think it's got a lot of really useful information and thoughts on how to solve these challenging problems. And a big part of it is breaking through these silos.
Thanks a lot, James. It sounds like a good resource. So one of the things I'm hearing from all of you, or I guess sort of hearing between the lines, is that if we can maximize use of these billions of incoming dollars that have a lot more flexibility than we may have previously imagined, that it frees up other dollars that have been used for things like, installing EV chargers, right? So we know there's things like resources from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative or resources from the Volkswagen settlement, and those have been really dedicated to those spaces. So I'm sure there's some clean energy advocates who are attending this webinar who probably have some ideas as to where those dollars, like VW dollars, Reggie dollars, can go to help us also achieve our climate goals while we maximize the flexibility from these transportation dollars. But I guess I just want to make sure that I'm hearing you right. That's what I'm hearing. So I guess I just want to make sure that I'm translating this in a way that really represents the point of view that I think I've heard from all of you. Does that sound right? Alex, you're smiling, so I'm going to call on you.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have heard is that one of the first steps when you get these funds that do have, like James said, a lot of latitude in what they can be spent on, one of the first steps is setting a strategy and setting a goal. So what is the goal of the funding? Is it reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Is it making the state safer? Is it, reducing traffic, which is another great goal. And I think the bottom line is widening highways doesn't do any of that. And we know that from this report, we know that that has confirmed in a lot of other reports that we've seen. Like we said, these kinds of investments, once we have a big overarching strategic goal such as that, it makes it a lot easier to prioritize what we end up spending this money on.
Thanks, Alex. Anybody want to add to the flexibility issue? John?
I would like to just jump in here for transit.
Go for it, Zoe.
Because there is such a big focus on EVs, and that is not going to get us where we need to go, figuratively or literally. And more than anything else, we will check more boxes with investment in transit and active transportation surrounding transit so people can access the transit than we will from EVs, because EVs necessitate someone being able to afford a car. We are a very long way away from a functional secondary market for EVs. And I very strongly believe that, mobility is a precondition for equity. If you can't get places in a functional amount of time because you don't own a car, you're kind of stuck where you're going to be. And that's what we really need to be looking forward. And also, again, to Alex's earlier point, this is huge when it comes to ADA compliance as well. And NJ Transit starting to get there. I personally live at a low platform station, which if you've ever seen someone putting a stroller or a bicycle into, it's really difficult. And so making sure that we are not just like, again, EVs are fantastic and ZEVs for, the larger vehicles, but we can't be looking at this through a road solution. And that's still kind of what that is. It needs to be a diverse structure of investment. So I would just plug for transit and active right there.
Yeah,
I think that's a great segue to John.
That's absolutely true. EVs check the reduced greenhouse gas emissions box, and maybe that's the limit of what EVs do for us, because it's basically just moving from one technology to another with congested highways and lots of parking and crashes and all the things that come along with single occupant vehicle use. I think I want to sort of bring up this point that James brought up with the blueprint. If we had a similar state agency syncing of the minds related to this, I think there would be, there's so much opportunity to be creative with all the dollars that are coming out of all of those agencies to achieve climate goals and all the things we've been talking about here. If we thought about a blueprint for decarbonizing the transport sector, it's going to bring in housing, it's going to bring in green infrastructure, it's going to bring all kinds of things that all of those agencies have as part of their missions. And I'd love to see that. We do something similar to that with mobility for people with disabilities. There's a federal group that looks at access and mobility for people with disabilities, and then we have one at the state level. And to do that same thing for decarbonizing transportation, I think would be an amazing move forward.
Thanks, John. And that's a really great segue to my last question, which is about really trying to focus a discussion here on next steps, right? We've talked about tremendous opportunities and the great benefits of ensuring that our investments go to climate smart transportation. But let's take a couple minutes now and sort of talk about what do we need to do to get from here to there? What actions does the state and who needs to be taking those actions over the next, let's say, 6 months, 12 months? Who are the decision makers, including ourselves, right? And again, James, you're welcome to jump in here if you're seeing some great ideas elsewhere, or if you have some thoughts. But so I guess what I'm really asking is if everyone could just take a couple minutes and outline what you think the next steps are, 6 months, 12 months, and who needs to be taking them. Anyone want to start with that? Go for it, John.
I would love to see more visible leadership from in the space of transportation and climate, meeting our climate goals and greenhouse gas reduction. You know, to see the governor and the commissioner of DEP, the commissioner of transportation, all stand up saying we're recommitting to complete streets, we're recommitting to VMT reduction, we're seriously committing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and all the decisions that we're making. You know, most of the visibility on the governor's climate initiatives has been the Department of Environmental Protection and BPU. You know, this isn't to say that the Department of Transportation is not doing anything, but the visibility of the actions is really missing. And I would love to see the DOT become that visible leader for greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Thanks, John. High visibility. Other thoughts?
I mean, I noticed in the chat people saying putting pressure on DOT. I mean, I might put it a different way of just get to know your DOT. I went to the NASTO meeting of the state DOTs this past year in Hartford, and I didn't see anybody I knew from the advocacy community or NGOs. I think it's important to get to know what makes these agencies tick and you know how they make their decision-making processes, get involved. There are public processes that they have to follow when they develop their transportation plans, and working with MPOs, so find out who your MPO is and how you can plug into the processes of how this pipeline of projects gets developed and how you can maybe play a role in influencing that. That's maybe how I would put it. Yeah.
James, let me ask you to elaborate on one aspect of that I've heard you talk about before, which is the opportunity that's presented to us by the update to the STIP. Could you sort of reflect on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. I meant to say, I mean, I think New Jersey is going to have the current STIP, the State Transportation Improvement Plan. It gets updated, periodically, and the current STIP, it's a 5-year plan for investment. That includes, it's a requirement by the federal government to put together a list of the projects that the state's going to use their federal funding on. So that is where the rubber meets the road, pardon the pun. There are the long-range transportation plan, that's important too, but it doesn't determine where the projects are actually funded. The STIP is where the projects that are listed, they ultimately get funding. And New Jersey is going to be updating its STIP with the bipartisan infrastructure law sort of accounted for this summer. So perhaps John or others on the call know exactly what public comment periods might be happening between now and then, or opportunities to engage in informing that process. But I think that's what I'll say. I could go on and on, but the planning process and the STIP development is a very, it's a complicated process. Like that's another thing you all could do is become more familiar with that if you want to influence it.
Yeah, so I think I would put that in, my bucket of what are 6 and 12-month actions. So let me open it up to Alex and Zoe. Thoughts you might have in terms of actions over the next 6, 12 months or so.
Sure. So I've been using this quote a lot recently because we are about to enter into state budget season here in New Jersey. So in just a few weeks, our governor is going to give his budget address. And then in a few months after that, the legislature is going to finalize it. So I have been saying, I've been borrowing this quote from a very famous former vice president and current president. Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. So to me, it matters less what I hear and it matters more what actions I see. So we have had amazing progress in this state on reducing greenhouse gas, addressing climate change, helping environmental justice communities fight against their overburdening pollution, and we need to continue it. To steal another quote from Doug O'Malley from Environment New Jersey, it gets late real early out here. So the climate crisis is accelerating, which means we also need to accelerate in how we address it. So I am excited, and I hope that what comes out of this report is, like I said, those strategic plans that have a specific goal in mind for how this money gets spent. The end coming out of that are all those co-benefits.
Thanks, Alex. Zoe?
I adore that quote, Alex.
I love that quote.
That is fantastic. And I will tell you something that each and every one of you can do immediately upon exiting this fantastic panel is one of the things that's not supported by the IIJA that is incredibly important is transit operating funds. You can write to your local officials. I recommend both assembly people and senator, and strongly advocate for transit operating funds in the budget. New Jersey is one of the few states that does not have dedicated funds. They've been shafted for decades across, you can't even blame one governor. It's decades of governors and legislatures have been underfunding them. And again, a huge piece to creating the cultural change that we need to have adoption of these transformative projects is we need trains running on time. We need buses that are consistent and reliable and otherwise affordable, because when New Jersey uses a much higher percentage of fare increase, some fare box revenue to support the system, and that's puts some of our most vulnerable residents in danger. And then I also want to reiterate something that John said earlier. You know, it's great that New Jersey is skewing towards the low emission side already. That's fantastic. A lot of people have been spending decades trying to get us there, because let's just say the 90s were not great in that department. But to that point, you know, there was some chiming in the chat there that I saw. It's not even just DOT and DEP. We have FEMA, we have OEM, we have almost every agency has a stake in this. And so if we can concentrate those funding pools and come up with a comprehensive and directed plan of action, we're just going to end up with a better outcome. And that, you know, that's just philosophically across the board, but very specifically with these. And so again, I think transit operations is one of the biggest things that you can do right now in this budget. And theoretically, you're all New Jersey residents and you can just reach out right after this. So that's my pitch.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So what I'm going to do now, I've been sort of every now and then looking at the chat, and not only is it an active chat, but it's a chat where people are talking to each other and not just necessarily to the panelists. So thank you. So I'm going to call on my colleague Marjorie Kaplan to come off mute and come on camera, and she's going to give us a little bit of a shout out of some of the questions that have been coming in the chat. So for our 4 participants to respond to.
Great. So we got a lot of, I have the questions in sort of 2 buckets. There's a bunch of questions. And by the way, great job, everybody. Really fascinating. Thank you. There's a bunch of questions on James's analysis. And I've grouped a couple of them that I think would be things that would be sort of hard to find if you go into your document, James. It might be easier to get from you, but for most of you, I think you can get the answers to these questions in James' analysis. And then there are a whole bunch of questions more on the policy side and citizen engagement. So we'll do this quickly. So one question came for whether or not where you got percentages, things for highway expansion. Is it solely a New Jersey number or is it a nationwide statistic? And thought you'd ask you that question for a person who really wanted to know. That's a good question.
That's a good question. So the high and the low scenarios were originally developed as bounding scenarios for where we thought kind of the federally, like I should say, U.S. wide, things could potentially end up. And historically, 25% is definitely on the high end of the amount of federal highway dollars that are spent, or transportation dollars that are spent on highway expansion. So that's the high scenario. And the low scenario, I think 5%, again, it's sort of on the low end of what in any given year, states will spend on highway expansion. So that's really how we did, based on historic spending of formula funding highway dollars. And those were originally intended to be bounding scenarios. And then we later came up with this very low emission scenario that I explained separately.
Great.
So
Thanks.
Marjorie, maybe we could focus on some of the policy questions that all of our panelists might want to weigh in on too.
Yeah, I will, but I kind of feel like we have a long time, Jean, here.
Well,
Questions.
how about if I suggest that we prioritize those? How's that?
Okay, fine. So one of the questions is whether or not we knew if there's an expansion plan that New Jersey Transit would have to increase operating capacity for mass transit.
They do have last year. I don't know. I can't remember what year it came out. It might have been 20, early 21. New Jersey Transit came out with their first ever 10-year strategic plan, or a strategic plan for how they're going to conduct their business. I think that the capital plan that they had was somewhat resource constrained, but there are certainly project proposals that have been out there for some time to expand light rail systems and things like that. And they also have been advancing an initiative called the New Bus Initiative, which is expected, hopefully, to kind of reimagine or realign bus services in the kind of major city areas, so Camden and Newark and Greater New Brunswick area, other places as well. So I think there are plans out there, and not all of them were funded in terms of what they were looking to do. So this funding could theoretically help that. We cannot lose sight of the fact, though, that these are capital dollars. And as Zoe pointed out, operating dollars are hard to come by. So any capital expansion of services is going to have some complementary expansion of operating support, because transit doesn't pay for itself. It is a public good, just like any other public good. And we shouldn't expect it to 100% pay for itself. Certainly, we're not paying our full share of what it costs to use New Jersey roadways. So why should we expect the same thing of the transit system? So I think, there are plans out there and mechanisms to implement them, but keeping track of the fact that the operating needs come along with expansion.
Agreed. If I can add one thing on there too,
Sure.
Guess how you get capital dollars out onto the road? It's through the process of procurement. Guess what funds procurement? Operations. So we also need to make sure that we realize that when we have an agency that has consistently been understaffed and there are actual problems getting successful, letting bids and getting the contracts out, it's going to slow the whole process down. And so operations isn't just engineers and bus drivers. It's this very diverse ecosystem that all of these agencies have, including design, which is something else we need to very much think about. We don't have a backlog of designed projects that we can just throw money at. We need to go through the design process to be able to get them out onto the street. And so just to throw that out there, I can't emphasize enough, it's the most important thing. And I saw someone mention the NJ Transit board meeting, and that's great. But what's really, really important is that they're not in charge of the state appropriations. And so the governor and the legislature need to be hearing from people, because when it comes to the capital side, there is a lot of people advocating for capital projects, because a lot of people, there's huge economies based around, infrastructure construction. I used to represent that industry. But on the operations side, it's a much quieter community. We don't have that same force of advocacy in that. And so that is legitimately where we need the voices. So
Thanks, Zoe.
So there's been a lot of talk about advocacy in the chat box as well, and how people stay engaged. And James, you talked about getting to know your DOT and how they make decisions, and you folks have given some other examples here. So one of the suggestions in the chat box was an analysis of the decision-making process. Is there such a thing that exists? And
Marjorie, do you mean in terms of appropriation?
yeah,
dollars?
as a resource for any of these things. So, John, is there something like that exists for folks to get their hands on to understand where the pressure points are?
There are certainly guides to how transportation decisions are made, and what those processes look like. And there are opportunities for intervention in a lot of places, but the decisions are made by elected officials at pretty much all of those points. So the pressure is your elected officials at the municipal, at the county level. The metropolitan planning organizations, they have a county commissioner rep that reps all the interests of the counties on each of those boards. A few of the cities, larger cities in New Jersey, New York, Jersey City are represented in the north. So all of those points are places where pressure can be brought to make sure that the decisions that are being made according to the agreed priorities. And I think, at least from the metropolitan planning organization perspective, things like equity, climate, they're all the words are in the plans. But as Alex pointed out, sometimes those don't, carry as much weight as the projects that get put in the capital plan.
And also, as like Alex had pointed out earlier, is the voices in that process, are not necessarily the voices that are sort of getting the greatest amount of burden, right? Particularly environmental burden, but other types of burden, economic burdens from investments that are not climate smart.
There's a citizen's guide to transportation decision making that I'll try to find it and stick it in the chat.
Wow, that's crazy. Alex, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, and adding on to something Zoe said about how people can get involved, and I've actually seen some people in the chat say that they are already on their local environmental commission, which is fantastic, especially as someone who used to work for the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions. But getting involved at the local level is such a great way to start learning about the decision-making process. Your local government, I can guarantee, needs your help. They need volunteers, and they need volunteers that care about addressing the climate crisis. They need volunteers that care about creating a more accessible state, that care about reducing air pollution. It is such a great way to start learning about this, and so many planning decisions are made on the local level that affect all kinds of climate decisions. Land use planning, how we spend, what kind of grants we go for. There is a lot that you can do at the local level that starts getting you involved.
I want to just add one quick thing that hasn't been brought up to just echo, because I wholly agree with Alex's point. That is where the rubber meets the road, and that is where we need people to be. And so one thing there is also, don't think of this just as like, okay, I want to talk about transportation to my mayor. Land use decisions are a huge part of this. And so if you're putting curb cuts every 20 feet on your street, you're going to have traffic. And then you're going to have a mayor who is not a transportation expert say, well, I'm going to run my next election based on widening this roadway, as opposed to reducing the traffic and maybe closing some of those curb cuts, or redesigning a local neighborhood where there's only one road in and one road out. And that's going to create a bunch of local traffic. And so making sure that you're looking that, like we want our agencies to be kind of diverse in trying this, we need to be making sure we're looking at the ground at all of these pieces that add up to mobility.
So, but that also comes back to something that got touched on a little bit earlier in the webinar. I think John sort of touched on it, but I wonder whether we need to take it a little more head on in terms of, that local governments, particularly those that don't have a lot of capacity, which typically are those where the communities, have the greatest amount of burden, that we don't necessarily have a system in place to take ideas that are good, smart climate, smart investments that would also improve health and improve equity, improve safety. We don't necessarily have them ready to go in terms of shovel in the ground, like, okay, here's my application, bipartisan infrastructure law, money, decision makers. Can you fund this? So how do we make sure that we have that happening now so that we don't miss this opportunity? John, I think you raised it, so maybe I'll give you a shout out.
There is not a great mechanism for making sure that we have climate smart projects. Part of it, I guess, is education and sort of helping everyone understand the flexibility of the programs that are out there. There is a local aid resource center that the DOT runs, but they historically have not, it's relatively new, historically have not offered training on creative use of funding and things like that. And then ultimately it comes down to have a successful project, you have to have the resources to put in the planning and engineering and design work. And that just isn't there. So creating a pool of technical resources to multiply the capacity of towns, I think, is something that's going to be needed, or we're not going to see these right kind of solutions. I think we spend about $1 billion of capital program every year in terms of the Transportation Trust Fund on local aid, right? And almost the entire thing goes to resurfacing projects. So even in doing those could be done in a way that advance complete streets and things like that, but too often aren't. But the reason they go to resurfacing is because that's a very easy path to get projects on the street and spend the money. We know how to do that. Public works departments can do that. There's plenty of construction industry firms that do that. The creative stuff, we don't do as much.
I want to throw out there too that I personally worked on legislation. We had to change the local aid law to allow for an increased percentage of it to be used for design. And so if folks remember when Tiger grants happened, we kind of had a more robust program for a long time. We had a backlog of shovel-ready projects, and then Tiger happened and we had no shovel-ready projects left. And so keeping an eye on that. And so John hit it on the head. We do resurfacing because it's super easy. You put it out, voters feel it immediately, and you're like, done and done, whereas some of the more complicated things we should be thinking about, and we have to think about them in advance. So that design piece should not be lost.
Thanks, Zoe.
So another question we heard asked was whether or not, and I'm sure I know the answer to this, but I'll let you answer this, John, is whether the Interagency Council on Climate Resilience has played any part in addressing decisions on transportation infrastructure investments. I
certainly have not been on the inside of those discussions, but I think from what I've seen from the outside, the focus has been pretty much entirely on the resilience aspect of the climate equation, and not so much on the greenhouse gas mitigation side of it.
Great point. Thanks. So we also had a question about time frame. I think that'll be interesting for everybody to ask, to know. Do you know what the time frame is for New Jersey to decide how to use these BIL transportation dollars and the window for influencing decision making?
James,
5 to 8 years, depending on the program.
Yeah, and I think the first available monies is next fiscal year. Is that correct?
Well, I think the formula funding was available right away.
This year?
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
the
I
bridge
think
funding came out first, and then the formula funding came out early last year. Yeah.
And they've been putting on the street the discretionary funds as discretionary programs as well, kind of on a rolling basis. But so those will come back again, I think, because they haven't been expending the entire program amount allocated to those programs in the first couple of years. So it's available.
It's there. It's on the street.
The time for us to have decided how to do this was probably well before the bill was.
Well, I would also bring back to Alex's point is the time frame. Every let's say March to late May when we're making our budget decisions. I would also like to flag that as a big pressure point as well.
Yeah, maybe it's a wake-up call as much as anything that, these investment decisions matter, and maybe you can't influence how the dollars are spent in 2023, but get busy focused on 2024 and 2025.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And I'd also like to add, keep in mind, this is one transportation bill that, yes, gave us more money, but all of the things that we've been talking about, just keep doing them. After the money runs out, we need to keep doing it. We need to, again, create culture, so.
Opportunity to hit the reset button because we got a windfall of funds.
Exactly.
So Marjorie, I'm looking at the clock. I think we probably have time for one more question.
Oh, okay. Wow. So I think for some of these folks, they're wanting to know, there's a lot about advocacy, but where can they go for resources as volunteers with their community to, for instance, help acquire funding for projects? What can they do at a real local level? Who can help them, for instance? I know that wasn't the overall, but this is what folks are interested in.
Sure. I can start with a plug for my former organization, the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions. They have a ton of resources on how to help your local officials make good environmental decisions. So they have trainings every year for environmental commissioners and general resources as well. And all the organizations that you see represented on this call sign up for their email list so that you can get information on when they put out new reports, when there are calls to action. There's lots of times where, like Zoe said, we need you to call your local representatives, and those calls make such a huge difference. It is so much more strong coming from the people on the ground who are most affected by this, who are actually in the districts of the representatives that need to make these decisions. So do not think that your call does not matter, because it really does.
No.
I'd also like to plug another organization, and that's Sustainable Jersey. And that's this kind of interesting offshoot of a larger association called the League of Municipalities. But this is a specific program that I think it's a good way to think of it as like LEED certification for towns. And you should find out, is your community in the Sustainable Jersey program? Because that certification helps give them a pathway to do this and a structure. So it's not just you doing this. That can be a direct ask, and they have a ton of resources in this. So I would also think about Sustainable Jersey in this.
Right, and lots of local actions that relate to transportation, land use, climate. I would plug the metropolitan planning organizations. I think all of them have programs that are supportive of things we've been talking about. They also have resources. They're also important in that sort of funding decision-making process in terms of what gets into their transportation programs as well. And then I'm going to shamelessly plug the Bicycle and Pedestrian Resource Center and the Safe Routes School Resource Center, which are funded by New Jersey Department of Transportation and located and administered by the Northeast Transportation Center at Rutgers. Great team of people, work all the time with local governments and citizen groups to advance bicycle and pedestrian mobility and safety, active transport, and safe routes to school.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm typing as fast as I can to put the links for the things you've mentioned.
I was going to say, Jean, you have done an amazing job transcribing everything that we have mentioned.
So I see we're kind of at time. So I first want to start off our thank yous by thanking James Bradbury from the Georgetown Climate Center for not only for joining us today and presenting, but for the amazing work that you have done. And again, if you look in the chat, you can see the link to Georgetown's overall analysis. I want to thank our colleagues, John Carnegie from the Rutgers University Voorhees Transportation Center, Alex Ambrose from New Jersey Policy Perspective, and Zoe Baldwin from the Regional Plan Association. Amazing insights, everyone. Thank you so much. Please know that we will post the recording on the Climate Change Resource Center website, and that's also in the chat. We also expect to be posting on the Climate Change Resource Center in collaboration with John's Voorhees Transportation Center. Not so much a guide for citizens, but we will publish sort of a compendium of what the different funding sources are coming and the opportunities there. And so that might be able to also help some of you who are asking questions about resources that you can use in terms of being engaged locally.
Yeah, a bunch of other great suggestions going through the chat as we speak.
I know. Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yes. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And as always, thanks from Marjorie and I to our colleague, Matt Drews, who helped us keep this webinar on track. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Take care. Have a great day and a nice weekend. Bye-bye. Stay well.
Thank you.
Too.